Okay, everybody, good morning. Welcome back. Just gonna get the stream started here. Hopefully you guys are having a good day so far and had a good weekend. And yeah, we'll just wait a few minutes and we'll get started at 9. Morning, Ryan. Welcome back. Hi, Connor. Morning. Ellie, how's it going? Julia, Kylie, Alex, Sloan. Good to see everybody. So it's March now. First 2 months kind of flew by, or did they? I don't know. People always say time flies. Sometimes to me it feels like it's going really slow. But yeah, it's nice to be at March. I like the warm weather of March. My birthday month, so that's always nice. Hi, Grant, Eloise. Good to see you guys. Morning, Dimitri. Any March birthdays? I wonder. Hey there, Ryan. Good morning. Morning. Hi, Nicole, Stephen. Just sent you some comments, Stephen, so you can see those whenever you have some time. Amanda, Brian, good to see everybody. Okay, so it's 9 a.m. I'm going to let us get underway. Welcome back, guys. Hopefully everything's going well. As usual, feel free to just leave a comment behind anytime you like, and I'll use that as a way of keeping track of your attendance and stuff. So yeah, today is part 2 of our lecture on Kant. We're working through the material on ethics in this class, and last week we spent 2 class periods talking about John Stuart Mill and the theory of utilitarian ethics, and now we're trying to learn a little bit about a much different ethical system. And this is the one that comes to us from the German philosopher Immanuel Kant and his ethical framework called Kantian ethics. So we're just studying the ideas and the writings of this man, Immanuel Kant. He lived from 1724 until 1804. And you know, I didn't really write the title of his big book last time because it's kind of, you know, a mouthful. But anyway, what it's called is grounding. Sometimes people call it groundwork, but in our textbook they label it as grounding for the metaphysics of morals. Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, that was originally published in German in 1785. So just so you're aware, this is the title of the big book that Kant wrote in 1785, and that is where we're lifting a small section, and that's what's in our textbook that we're studying. So yeah, let's try and remember some of the basic details and facts about his ethical theory. First of all, this is a little bit of review to kind of get our brains back on the topic of Kant and his ethics. But let's see. First of all, with Kant's ethics, it's not at all about the consequences that happen after what you do. Okay, so in utilitarian ethical theory, it was all about the consequences. That's a consequentialist theory of ethics, and what it says is that the results, the effects of what you have done, are what really matter the most in terms of the morality of your actions. So from the John Stuart Mill utilitarian point of view, if you take an action that produces better overall consequences for human happiness, then that's the right action. And an act that produces the reverse of this or does not generate as much overall happiness, that's not the right thing to do. That's what Mill said. So it's all about like gauging the probable consequences of your options and then just acting in accordance with whichever one would, lead to the most overall happiness. But Kant doesn't say that at all. So from Kant's perspective, the right action is instead just to act with a good will and a good intention to uphold the moral law. As long as you act with a good will, then the consequences don't really matter, at least in terms of defining whether your act was moral or immoral. So if it is Kant, we don't focus on the consequences later. We instead look back to the intentions the person had when they did the act. I give you one quick scenario to help illustrate some of these basic structural differences. Like I gave a case where someone was trying to provide help to a stranded motorist that seemed to be injured, but in doing so, they inadvertently moved them in a way that caused an even worse spinal injury. Now, in that case, the person's well-intended, but ultimately foolish decision to move the person led to a lot of harm. And therefore, if it was just about consequences, the utilitarian would say this was bad and wrong. But from a Kantian perspective, the consequences were bad, but the intention was good. So therefore, the act was not immoral. So it's all about the intentions from Kant's perspective. So he says what you should be doing then is trying to set your mind to act from a good will to uphold the moral law. He says after this that it is only the good will that is unconditionally good. Why is it that the good will should be the thing highlighted and focused on in an ethical system, everything revolving around trying to have a good will and act with a good will? He says it is because that is the only thing in the world that is unconditionally good. And by comparison, he lists other desirable traits or attributes that people could have. Think of character traits like intelligence, perseverance, strength, charisma, wealth, power, even happiness. All of these other things, he says, it depends. They're good sometimes, but if the wrong kind of person has those features, then it's not so good. Do you really want someone who's out there stalking you to be the most intelligent person in the world? No. So if a person has bad intentions, then they will put these ordinarily good qualities to bad use, and that will simply make them even more dangerous and harmful. Therefore, we cannot say without qualification that it's a good thing for a person to be intelligent. I mean, at least in the moral sense of goodness. It might suit their purposes, whatever evil purposes they may have. But if we're talking about whether it's morally good, the question remains, well, only if you have a good will are you going to make the proper use of any such qualities. So that's why he says try to have and maintain and upstand a good will, and then you're focusing on the unconditionally good thing at least. Okay, from there, I started to talk to you about his principle that it is only an act that is done from goodwill which has moral worth. And by comparison, he says an act that is done from the motive of inclination has no moral worth at all. Now, that's kind of where we left the class period last time, and we were talking about the shopkeeper scenario, the shopkeeper example. So I'll just quickly say what it is again, and then we can go to the last part of Kant's writing. The shopkeeper example is a scenario we imagine where there's a shopkeeper who has a golden opportunity to pretty much inflate the price and gouge the cost of an item for, let's say, an inexperienced purchaser, like a child. The child asking how much is this candy bar, let's assume, doesn't know the real price and wouldn't follow up if you gave them the wrong cost so that they would pay more than what other customers pay. So suppose the shopkeeper has a chance to tell him the wrong price and get extra money, and he's very tempted by the prospect and he wants to do that, but he forces himself not to just because he recognizes that it would be immoral. Compare this to a case where the shopkeeper wants to give the fair price immediately due to his love and desire to be fair and just. So in that second case, he also gives the fair price, but he's not doing it merely based on the principle that it is correct. Instead, he's doing it because of the pleasant feeling that comes from doing it. So in Kant's judgment, or analysis, whatever, the first type of action is the one which actually does receive moral credit, or it's an action which has moral value. Because in the first case, the person is not inclined to do what duty requires for them to do. But they do it nonetheless, despite having a disinclination to it. So the most clear case of a person acting strictly from the motive of duty is when they have a contrary inclination to not do what is correct, but they force themselves to do it anyway. Because again, if we look at our first shopkeeper who gave the fair price despite their desire to be unfair, when you ask why did they give the fair price, then we can't say, oh, because they felt like it, because it just felt good or it made them happy. To the contrary, it didn't feel good and it made the person a little unhappy, but they did it anyway just because it was moral. So in that case, we don't have to question, was it done simply because of self-interested motive or because of the pleasure about it? No, it was done merely on a moral basis. Here I'll read a little bit in the works of the author, and you can hear him talk about this shopkeeper example. So he says, for example, that a dealer should not overcharge an inexperienced purchaser certainly accords with duty, and where there is much commerce, the prudent merchant does not overcharge but keeps to a fixed price for everyone in general, so that a child may buy from him just as well as everyone else may. Thus, customers are honestly served. But this is not nearly enough for making us believe that the merchant has acted this way from duty and from principles of honesty. His own advantage required him to do it. He cannot, however, be assumed to have in addition an immediate inclination toward his buyers, causing him, as it were, out of love, to give no one, as far as price is concerned, any advantage over another. Hence, the action was done neither from duty nor from immediate inclination, but merely for a selfish purpose. Okay, so like, we can imagine that a person doesn't want to overcharge because they're worried about word getting out on Yelp or something, and then that undermining their business prospects with other customers later. That would also be a decision to be fair, but out of the desire for self-advantage and self-interest. So the purest case is where you do it not at all because it benefits you, profits you, or feels good, but just because of the principle that it is right. Now, when I've learned this material over the years and taught it so many times, the page I just mentioned, thank you, Ryan, that was page 107. So you'll see the discussion there on 107 of the book. This whole shopkeeper example, I understand and I can relate to anybody who finds it a bit odd that it is the first shopkeeper's action, which is the one with moral credit and value, and the second one which doesn't. Because you might look at those two shopkeepers and say, well, isn't the second one a better person because they just want to do the right thing? They feel good about doing the right thing. So isn't that a nicer person or something? The first person's kind of nasty because they don't want to do the right thing at all. They want to rip the kid off, but they feel like that's just their obligation. So this is why they do it. Well, let me try and make it a little bit more reasonable to you if I can. Where I think Kant is coming from is this. You would only really give a person moral credit, like a moral pat on the back, like good on you, good job for doing the right thing. You would only give a person moral credit of such a kind if what they did was difficult for them, not easy, right? So like here, I'll give you another quick contrast. Suppose that you have two different people that both go on a run every single day. Me, I'm kind of like that. I do run almost every day. So, I haven't taken a day off since February the 1st, but I think I'll probably rest today. I'm feeling a little sore. Anyway, though, take a runner, a daily runner, okay? This person runs the routine each morning when they get up and they go out, they, let's say, do like 3 miles in the morning, okay? Now, take runner number 1. When they wake up at that 9 a.m. or whenever they wake up and they do their 3 miles, they're like, oh, God, I hate this. This is just such a pain. I really don't enjoy it. I don't like the exertion, the soreness that comes with it, the sweating and the panting. To be honest, it's just really unpleasant, and I kind of hate it. But I feel like I have an obligation to stay fit, and out of a feeling of, duty to my health and well-being, I'm going to force myself out of bed and go through the motions and get that run in just because I know it's a good thing, even though I find no enjoyment or pleasure in it, okay? So here's one type of runner. They don't like the experience. To the contrary, they wish they would rather not even do it, but they think that it's good for their health, so they force themselves to do it against their disinclination. Now take another case. This is another type of runner. When they wake up, they're doing the same routine every morning. Maybe this guy and the other guy pass each other on their opposite routes, but the second person I'm mentioning here loves the run. They love the feeling. They love the experience. They wouldn't have it any other way. Even if it had no health benefits, they just love, being up, moving, sweating. So all the things that the first guy dislikes, the second guy loves, and he finds it so enjoyable. So he's smiling, he's chipper, he's happy as he's running. The other guy, he's kind of like, this is a bummer, and this is like, I'm just getting through it. Okay, so now take the two people. They're both, let's say, doing the exact same running routine every day, but with these two different mental understandings of what they're doing, these two different attitudes and inclinations. So out of the two individuals, who do you think would be the more appropriate to say, good job for sticking with the running? You know, you deserve moral credit for that. Would it be the first person for whom it's difficult, or the second person for whom it's the greatest joy? You understand my question? Like, who of those two individuals do you think would be the more fitting recipient of like moral praise, commending the person for doing something which is not so easy to do? Isn't it clear enough? But let me know in the chat. It's the first. That's right, Patrick. So the first person receives moral commendation and credit and worth because they're doing something that's not fun, and they're doing it just because they know it's the right thing to do. Now, the second person, they're doing the same workout, they're getting the same benefits, but do they really need a moral praise for it? Hey, you know, good job doing the favorite thing that you love to do every day. That's not a struggle, that's not difficult. It's what they're already inclined to do and what they already receive pleasure from doing. So you can say that they like it, but you can't really say that they're making a moral choice to do it. They're choosing pleasure. Another example, okay, and I'll just stop after this one. Take two people with two similar diets, super healthy, like to the maximum extreme, you know, health, like just health focused, right? So like it could be like a Tom Brady type of diet, no sugar, like no fried foods, everything super portioned out. Okay, now take one person that's on this diet and they hate it, and they're like, man, I really wish I could eat more, you know, fatty, sugary, etc., big portion foods. That's what I really love, just to pig out on junk food. But I know that this is good for my health and I'm trying to get healthier, so I'm going to stick with it even though the food is bland and I'm not interested in it and it's just, I hate this diet, but I'm going to do it. Now another person, this other person has totally different tastes. The second person, they love this food. They wouldn't eat it any other way. You know, they find fatty foods and salty foods and sugary foods disgusting. You know, that's just not to their taste. So while they're eating, you know, pile of like macrobiotic greens or whatever and sprouts, they're loving every minute of it, and it's like their favorite meal. So out of those two people, who should you say gets moral credit for sticking to the tough diet? The person who hates it, but they're doing it anyway, or the person who this is literally their favorite meal? See, the second person doesn't need moral credit. Why would you walk up to someone and say, hey, good job for eating your favorite food that you like more than anything? That's not something that is like a difficult moral choice, and it requires no principle. It's not done for principle, it's done for pleasure. So Kant is saying then, again, just coming full circle, that it's only really when the act is done from the motivation of duty, not from inclination, that it's a moral act where, you know, you're doing it because it's the right thing and not just because it's to your liking. Okay? So anyway, that's the shopkeeper example, some additional discussion of it. Now there's one last major piece to this whole Kantian ethics that's hanging over our discussion here that we have to finish with and make sure to understand. Because I told you that what is it to act with a good will? And it's to act from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law. In fact, that's so important that I'll put it here again. Okay, so if you want to be a good person according to the ethical principles formulated by Kant, then you would try to always to act with a good will, meaning that you would try to act from the motivation of duty alone to uphold the moral law. But what is this moral law? Okay, that's like the big question still. If I'm supposed to, according to this theory, if we are supposed to act from a sense of duty to uphold the moral law, then of course we want to know, well, what is this moral law and how could we possibly discover what it is? Well, okay, so Kant does say there is a moral law, and he says this moral law is universal, it's objective, it's not relative, it doesn't change from person to person or place to place or time to time. There's a universal moral code, there's a moral law, and he says the way we can discover this moral law is simply by tapping into reason, you know, our human reason that we have got. Now, where does reason come from? That's, I guess he leaves it as an open question. It could be that it's come from God, you know, he created us with knowledge of good and evil according to certain biblical, accounts. Or if a person doesn't believe in this, then they could say that reason has evolved in mankind over a long period of natural selection. But either way you go, we have got reason. That's clear. That's the reason that I can talk to you, that we can use these computers, and that we have all the recorded history and academic study that we do have in technology. So humans are the rational animals. Using reason, we can discover all this stuff about mathematics, physics, how to split an atom, how to build a microwave, how to put a person on the moon or put a rover over on Mars. So he thinks by using the same kind of reason, the same tapping into that same intellectual resource that we have got, we can access and discover the moral law. Okay, so reason kind of unlocks for us the content of the moral law. And when we use reason, either God-given or naturally evolved, wherever you're standing on that question, but when we use our reason to discover the moral law, he says we will utilize a given principle, which he calls the categorical imperative. So to know about the moral law in Kant's philosophy, we now have to zero in and talk about what's called the categorical imperative, a major concept in his whole, work. Okay, so now it is categorical imperative. That'll help us learn more about the content of the moral law, according to Kant. Okay, so this is the categorical imperative. Fancy sounding word. And what it is, again, is it's just a rational principle that he thinks we can use to discover what the moral law is, what it commands us to do, and what it forbids us from doing. So here's the principle of the categorical imperative. There are two versions of it. Kant says the categorical imperative can be provided in two different formulations. Now, although the two different ways of defining or expressing the categorical imperative, they look a little different, they sound a little different, but in the end, they still lead us to the same moral action in each case. So let's try and learn about the two. Now, the first version, I'll call it version 1, so V1 of the categorical imperative. It says this, so I'll just write it down. And at a first pass, understand that it might appear a little confusing because it uses certain technical jargon that I would have to explain, but I will. So bear with me as I write it out, and then we'll break it down afterwards. So the first version of the categorical imperative says this. It says, act always so that the maxim which describes your action could be willed to be a universal law. Okay, so a couple of key things to break down here. Act also that the maxim which describes your action could be willed to be a universal law. All right. Now, I understand that a couple of terms here are still not clear to you, which is like the word maxim, and then what it could mean for a person to be able to will a maxim to be a universal law. So let's start off then with a little bit of description of this word and what it means, maxim. So a maxim is just a person's individual principle of action. It's kind of like a person's own individual policy statement of what they do under what sort of circumstances, okay? So given that, the description of a maxim takes a certain type of form. Let me show you the format of a maxim, basically. Here's the form of a maxim. It's a principle that says something like this. I will do some action, and so I'll label it as C. I will do, no, not C. I will do action X in circumstances C. Okay, so the maxim is basically just a principle which says what you will do in certain given circumstances. So I label the action with the variable X because it could be any number of different possible cases or scenarios. and I label the circumstances given with the variable C to stand for whatever the relevant circumstances are in the example that we're talking about. So like, for example, right now, anything that a person ever does that they do on purpose, deliberately, meaning that it's not like accidental or done by force against you, anything that you do of your own free will or your own volition, there's a maxim associated with that action. And the maxim associated with your action in that case is just you saying what it is that you do and what the circumstances are that compel you to do that. So like, for example, right now you're attending a lecture on YouTube Live, and so there's a maxim about that, since you're doing it on your own purpose, on your own free will. I guess in your case, the maxim right now is something like this. I will attend a lecture. And what circumstances are these that have led you to decide? Like, what is your policy for attendance? Not mine, but your own, you the student. Like, when and under what circumstances do you take this decision or you take this action of attending a lecture? I would say it's something very straightforward, nothing too complicated, right? Probably it's along these lines. I will attend a lecture in case I'm able to attend and if it is in session, like if it is happening at that time, if it's scheduled, right? And I think that that's pretty much accurate to your fact of what you're doing right now. Yeah, Patrick, you say to be on track with school. Sure. So let's now consider what it is to convert this maxim into a universal law. Okay, so this categorical imperative just says the following, but beneath all the jargon and technical sophistication of it, it's actually saying something pretty simple. It's just saying when you do an action, think about the principle that you're doing the action on, and then imagine what would happen if everybody acted the same way. So now you have to imagine not just you acting on that maxim, but everybody who's in the same circumstances doing the same thing. So the universalized maxim, the universal law version of it, I'll put the letter UL over here. Actually, you know what? I want to have a little more room so you know that this header just states the name of this principle, categorical imperative, right? Now up here, what's the universalized version of a maxim? The universal law version just says all people will do X in circumstances C. All people will do the same as me, basically. So, okay, if the maxim of your current action is, I will go to class when I'm able to go and when it is in session, then as a universal law, that would be converted as the statement, all people will attend their classes when they're able to go and when the class is in session. So if that were a universal law, there would be no problem with that. It would not be incompatible with what you would want, and it would not be undesirable. So it's not undesirable, nor is it contradictory. Therefore, this action passes the bar of the moral law, and it's allowed by the moral law. So the categorical imperative just asks you to consider your principle of behavior each time you do something, and then imagine what would be the case if everyone who was in the same circumstances did the same type of action on the same principle. If it would be possible for everybody to act the way you're acting, then it's okay, and you should just feel free to go ahead and do it. It's not immoral. But if the action that you are going to take would not be possible for all to do or would not be desirable for all to do, then you're doing something wrong. It violates the moral law, and it's forbidden ethically. Okay, so I gave you just an easy example now of doing something that's not wrong. So congratulations, you've done nothing wrong by attending this lecture. But the more interesting examples to be given are of actions that failed this test, okay? And so let me just hit you with a whole random assortment of examples in which the categorical imperative is violated and therefore the act is rendered immoral. Okay, so I'll work with a couple of easy enough examples. How about this? Suppose that someone is waiting in a long line. Sometimes you're waiting in a long line. I guess we used to always hate lines. Probably we still do, but it's almost like a bygone memory of a past time when we would all collect in big groups. But anyway, suppose that you're waiting in a long line for something. It could have been, something that you're buying for retail, or it could be, like the line to gain passage on an airplane or anything else. Okay, long line. Well, with long lines, a lot of people feel impatient. They don't like waiting patiently until they finally get to the front. So suppose there's one person in this line towards the back, and they just don't like the fact of how long it is and how long they have to wait. So they're thinking of doing something, and what they're thinking of doing is cutting the line. Okay, like so they can get closer to the front of it. So what's the maxim of the cutter? Put yourself in the headspace of the cutter for a minute and think of their principle. So we already know the first part. I will cut a line. I will cut a line, and what will be the circumstances leading this hypothesized person? But there are real people like this. Anyway, it's in our case a hypothetical. What's the circumstance? I will cut a long line. In what circumstance? What's the circumstances of our cutter? What's the situation which leads them to do the cutting? Easy to say, but you should just hit me with that and let me know. When it's long, okay, perfect, Dimitri, yes. So let their maxim be such. I will cut in line when there's a long line, okay? Now, imagine that that's a universal law, though, okay? Like not just the one person, but now it's elevated to the level of a universal law that holds it on everybody with no exceptions. So now it is this new principle or law. All people will cut a line whenever there's a long line. Okay, so though we're now considering it as a universal law, imagine if everybody did that. Would that even be possible? Is it possible for 100% of all members of the line to universally all cut it? This is not possible. I hope you guys can comprehend and think of the scenario in your mind. I mean, if everybody cuts the line, what happens? There's no longer a line. There's just a mob trying to rush towards the entrance of the front. And therefore, there's no longer any kind of orderly system for people to gain entrance. Furthermore, okay, if everybody cut the line, then what would happen when the cutter cuts? The cutter's in the back, they cut ahead, now they're closer to the front. But if 100% of everyone in the universe cuts lines, then what would happen in case somebody who cut the line got closer to the front? Let me know what would happen afterwards if everybody cuts, right? We're going into this hypothetical that it's not just the one person who does it, but all. If all cut, then is there really any point? Because basically what would happen to the individual who did the cutting? That's my question, a little follow-up to the hypothetical. So you're imagining that this is now a universal law. So they would be back at the back of the line, right, Ellie? Why? Because if everybody cuts, then everyone cuts the cutter after they cut. And so therefore, there's no even advantage to be gained by the cutter. What does the cutter really want? What the cutter wants is not for everybody to do what they're doing. The cutter wants everybody else, except for them, to follow the single file rules of the line so that they can gain an advantage over all the rule followers by breaking the same rule. It doesn't work to the advantage of the cutter if everybody breaks the rule, because then whatever new placement in line that they've acquired will simply be set back by the act of all the other people cutting it again. So the cutter knows, therefore, according to Kant's philosophy, that they're doing something wrong. And all they have to do to understand that it's wrong is to just contemplate for a moment what would happen if everybody did the same thing. And if everybody did the same thing here, there would no longer even be a line to cut, nor would there be any advantage gained by moving forward in the sequence of people that are standing there. Okay? So beneath the sophistication, like I was saying, of the principle and the language that is used, it's really just saying this. When you're doing actions, consider if it would be possible for everybody to do it on the same principle or not. And if it's not possible for everybody to act the way you're acting, then stop doing it. It's wrong. It's only okay to do things that it would be possible and not undesirable for everybody to do as well. Okay, so when you take actions where you're like, I know not everyone should do this, but I'm going to do it, that's wrong. Okay, and it's easy to understand what cases those are because you can see that the maxim breaks down when you turn it into a universal law. And we can go into other examples, okay, guys? So suppose that I want to steal from somebody, right? I'm a thief. So I see something valuable that belongs to somebody else, and I just want to take it so that I can own it and have the value of owning it. Well, what's the maxim, let's say, of the thief? I will take someone's property when I desire to have it, okay? Now, if that became a universal law, then it becomes this universal law. All people will take property when they want the things that the property is. If that was the universal law, then what would happen to the thieves' stolen items? Because stealing would no longer be the exception, but the law, the rule, then the stolen item would no longer be in their possession because it would quickly be stolen by another one of the universe of thieves that we all live with. So what does the thief want? Do they want everyone to be a thief like them? No, because then the stolen item cannot be maintained in their own possession. They want people to respect the laws of property so that when they steal something, it is not stolen out from underneath them afterwards. Therefore, they know they are doing something wrong because this is not a practice that could conceivably be turned into a universal law and still maintain the idea of property, which is at the heart of what the thief wants to take over. So you can see, again, an action that's wrong, and it's understood to be wrong when you simply consider it as a universal law. Take the free rider, the person who's going to ride the subway for free, perhaps. They don't want to pay the toll, so they're going to jump right over the toll booth or the turnstile and get on the bus or the train, subway, whatever, without paying. So that person's maxim is, I will ride for free on the subway when I want to take a ride on the subway. If that's the universal law, though, then who pays for the subway? Nobody, because in a universalized sense, everyone would be jumping the turnstile and not paying the toll. But if this was the case, then what would happen to our so-called subway? Well, it would lack funding, and without a funding mechanism, the service would have to be suspended or terminated, and then the free rider couldn't ride for free. So the free rider doesn't want 100% of patrons to ride for free. Otherwise, funding is eliminated, and then there's no longer a subway to ride for free. So in every case, Kant says reason can discover for you, if you simply use this categorical imperative, what actions are forbidden and which are permitted under the universal laws of ethics. The only actions that are permitted are those which could conceivably be done by all on the same maxim without either contradiction or undesirable outcome. And so another case could be lying. And this is actually one that Kant describes himself. So let me go into the lying promise as one more example of the current concept. He says, imagine that somebody would like to have some money, and they know that they have a friend who has some money that would give it to them, but the only way they will give it to them is if they make a promise to repay it. So they have to ask for it and request it as a loan. But suppose that we have a very dishonest, immoral person here, and so what they would like to do is get the loan generated by promising repayment, but with the full intention to never repay, so they can simply keep the money and pocket it. So they're making a false promise of repayment on a loan. That's the case. So the maxim of that person would be, I will make a false promise to repay a loan whenever I want some extra money. Okay? Now, if that's the universal law, right, then who will make false promises when they request loans? It wouldn't just be the one individual. If it was a universal law, that would be every single person that ever does request a loan. But ask yourself, what would be the situation if 100% of those that request loans lied about their ability to repay or their desire to repay? Would the lenders still offer such loans in that case? No, because they would know that 100% of people who make promises of repayment are all lying and they never ever do. So if that was the case, loans would no longer be given, and therefore the pretense of repayment that our liar is relying on could no longer be believed. And that's why, again, their chosen action cannot be a universal law and still succeed. In fact, it is the presumption of truth-telling in requesting loans as a general rule that the liar is exploiting in order that the perception of his truth-telling will allow him to lie and not be detected. Here I'll read the words of Kant, and now you can see him bring it into focus for you. He says, on page 109, okay, a man in need finds himself forced to borrow money. He knows well that he will not be able to repay it, but he sees also that he will not get any loan unless he firmly promises to repay it within a fixed time. He wants to make such a promise, but he still has conscience enough to ask himself whether it is not permissible or contrary to duty to get out of difficulty in this way. Suppose, however, that he does decide to do that. The maxim of his action would then be expressed as follows. When I believe myself to be in need of money, I will borrow money and promise to pay it back, although I know that I can never pay it back. Now, this principle of self-love or personal advantage may be compatible with his future welfare, but the question is whether it is right morally. So I then transform the requirement into a universal law and put the question thus: how would things stand if my maxim were to become a universal law? He then sees at once that such a maxim could never hold as a universal law of nature and be consistent with itself, but must not necessarily be self-contradictory, because the universality of a law which says that anyone believing himself to be in difficulty could promise whatever he pleases with the intention of not keeping it would make promising itself and the goal to be achieved by it totally impossible, insofar as no one would believe what was being promised, but would merely laugh at all such statements as being lies. Okay, so there you go. One of the two versions of the categorical imperative of Kant. So kind of taking a small step back, Kant has said that your moral charge, your obligation morally, is to always act from a sense of duty to uphold the moral law. That's when you act with a good will, and that's what you're morally obligated to do throughout. Whether that promotes the most overall happiness or not, you're solely responsible for acting from a sense of duty to uphold the moral law. Now we are hearing what the moral law is by means of the utilization of the categorical imperative. The moral law is whatever actions we are either forbidden or commanded to do according to the principle given here. We discover that when we formulate a maxim and we consider whether it could pass as a universal law without being contradictory or undesirable. And so actions based on bad maxims that can't be universalized are immoral actions that violate the moral law. And so your obligation is not to do those. So if you're wondering which ones are forbidden, work through the process of considering each action as a maxim that is converted into a universal law. And if it's possible for all to do that same thing without undesirable side effects or contradiction, then that's okay to do. Okay. So you first have to identify the relevant maxim and then consider the coherence and the desirability of making the maxim a universal law. If it could be willed to be such, then it's morally permitted, and if not, then it's impermissible. Now there's a second version of the categorical imperative too. So this is version 1, and I told you that we would also talk about the second one. Now, nice thing is that the second version is actually quite a bit simpler and more even easy to comprehend. I think the first one, once you understand it, is not that bad, but the second one's even easier. So categorical imperative version 2, and it says this. It says when you're dealing with other human beings like yourself, members of our species, our kind, when you deal with human beings, the rule is you must never treat another human being as a means to an end, but always treat humanity and human beings as an end in itself. Okay, so never treat a human being as a means. Never treat a human being as a means to an end. Always treat human beings as ends in themselves. Okay, so never treat a human being as a means. Always treat human beings as ends. Okay, so we've actually talked briefly about these words, means and ends, in previous meetings on utilitarian ethics. So now that knowledge will come back to help us again. Let me just ask us here then, while we're together, what do you know about the words means and ends? What is an end? What's the definition of an end? And then what is the definition of means? If anyone could tell me what that is. Let's just quickly say, and then that'll shed light on this statement here. Remember, you may remember John Stuart Mill saying that happiness is the only thing that people pursue as an end and not as a means. So it's, that may refresh your memory a little bit. What, though, is an end and what are means in comparison? Or is it not? Okay, good. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so means are actions taken to achieve one's goals, but end is a goal. Okay, good. So thank you for that, Ryan and Patrick. Now, look at this principle. What it says then, in more depth, is that you're never supposed to treat a human being as though they were just a thing that you are using to reach a goal that you have got. So don't use people as instruments or tools toward the achievement of your goals. Instead, you're supposed to treat the person, human beings, as though they are the goal. Like human beings are the goal for the sake of which you are acting, not things to be exploited, manipulated, or used in the pursuit of goals that you have. Okay, so like actions that are violating this principle. Suppose, for example, that, I don't know, you were in a dangerous situation, like some type of mass shooting, God forbid. And in the middle of that, some really even bigger and stronger person than you imagine scared for their own life, rushes up behind you, grabs you physically, and holds you in front of their body as they move through the scene. You know, they're scared. What are they doing? They're using you as a human shield. Now, would that be wrong? I hope you can just clearly and obviously see that, yes, it would be wrong. And why would it be wrong? Because you are a human being. You are not a table, a chair, a desk. So if I want to use an inanimate object like this desk as a shield blocking me from incoming shrapnel or bullets, no problem with that, because the desk doesn't have a will or intelligence. It doesn't have consciousness. It's an, inanimate, non-sentient thing. But a human being like me or you have got reason. We understand morality, and we therefore are worthy of dignity and respect. So he's just saying that with people, you're supposed to treat them like they're the goal themselves, not things that you would use to promote a goal you have. In my human shield hypothetical, which is a bit, I know, extreme, but I'm just trying to put a point out there. In the human shield example, what's the end being pursued by the individual who takes the person as a shield? Well, the goal being pursued is their own safety and survival. And there's certainly nothing wrong with having that as a goal. But what is wrong is using other people as tools towards the achievement of that goal if they themselves don't decide to make themselves serviceable to you in that way. Okay? It's kind of like theft. If I was at a wealthy person's like house party and I went into their trophy room and I saw like a valuable piece of, precious metal that I could simply take from them, they would never know because there's so many people there. And then I could sell it on the black market and have the money or whatever from it for myself. If I did that, then the goal of theft, in my case, is to attain the profit from the sale of their stolen item. And they are being used as a means to that end. Like them and their property is just a means. It's like I'm withdrawing from them as though they were just like a human ATM or bank account. So those things are not okay to do. All manner of force, fraud, exploitation, where you use another person to get something that you want, is in violation of the second version of the categorical imperative. Like, I don't know, suppose that a person was raped. I mean, that's a horrifying, terrible thing for anybody to do. But in the case of rape, the assailant is in the pursuit of some kind of, hard to imagine, but like sexual pleasure from the act. And they're using the other person who's not given consent as a means to that end. But again, a human being, a person, is not a toy, a tool, or a thing to be used for whatever purposes you may see fit. Instead, human beings have ultimate dignity and respect, so they're not to ever be used as a means. Do you guys recall the transplant scenario that I gave as I was closing out our lectures on utilitarian ethics? And I was trying to explain to you how one main problem with utilitarianism is that no action is totally forbidden in principle if it generated the most overall utility. And I said, for example, suppose that we had 5 different individuals who had organ failure, and one pretty much not very well liked, perhaps socially useless, person who has got 5 organs that could be used to save the other 5. I think it seems pretty clear, right, that it would be wrong to kill that one healthy person and use their organs to save 5. In utilitarianism, it's hard to say why it's wrong, though, because in their mind, it's just do whatever you have to do to promote the most overall happiness. But to a Kantian, is it okay to do that? No. Why not? Because in doing that, what would you be doing to the one victim of the transplanting? You'd be using them and their body parts, literally, as a means to the objective, to the goal of saving 5 other lives. And human beings are not things to be exploited or used as means toward the achievement of whatever goals there may be. So hopefully, is that kind of coming clear to you guys? Now, the last thing about this, there was a companion piece to our writings on Kant that I did assign for you guys to read. It was Honora O'Neill. She's just a more modern day commentator in philosophy who tries to make the Kantian ideas a little more simple for people to understand. So her paper was called A Simplified Account of Kant's Ethics. And what she says is that if you really want to boil down this second version of the categorical imperative to a simple statement, just think of it like this. You use someone as a means when you involve them in an interaction that they would not consent to. Okay, so here's Honora O'Neill's summary of this. You use someone as a means, which you're not supposed to do. You use someone as a means when you involve them in an interaction that they would not consent to. So I'm just going to put that here. I know it's running out of space, but try to make it look a little more clear. That's the general situation when a person uses someone else as a means. When you involve that person in an interaction that they would not consent to, or at least that they would not consent to if they had full information. So in the case of me stealing something from the wealthy person's trophy room, keeping it, and then selling it for my own profit, that interaction with the other person is not consented to by the victim of theft. That's why it's not a gift. It's something that was done without their permission, so it's certainly wrong. Case of rape, by definition, it's an act taken against another person without consent to that. The human shield scenario, it's not a case where someone volunteers or offers themselves up for that purpose, but they're being recruited against their will physically for the sake of the other person's personal pursuit of safety and security. So human beings, anyway, are not just things. They're not objects, but they're subjects. So you're supposed to treat people with the full measure of rational dignity and respect that you expect to receive from others. I know that if you had been taken as a human shield in a situation like that, you'd feel righteously aggrieved because you're being used by that person against your will for their purposes. And so morality is a two-way street. The same kind of things that would affront you as a disrespect to your human dignity are the same things that you're morally charged with extending to others whenever you interact with them. So respect humanity, don't treat people as means to an end. Now, one little thing to know about this is that it doesn't forbid us from being helpful to each other as long as we are all on the same page and we consent to our role in the interaction. So like if you help me with my homework and I don't know, like help you with some professional stuff that you're doing at your job, it kind of looks like a quid pro quo. Are we violating the categorical imperative? Well, no, because if we're both fully informed and fully consenting to our role in the mutually beneficial transaction, then neither party has been exploited. That's why, like, if I go and I buy like a Starbucks coffee, the barista who serves me the coffee is not being exploited because he or she or they fully consent to their role in the interaction since they're working at will and they're not being enslaved or forced to do it without their choice. But if you are dealing with a person that's providing a service who has been enslaved, then you can say this is an exploitation of them because the slave, unlike the at-will employee, hasn't been given a chance to consent to what they're doing and therefore doesn't make themselves a willing participant in the interaction. So 2 ways of looking at morality from the categorical imperative. Version 1, double check to make sure your action could be made into a universal law. Version 2, just make sure that you're not doing anything that involves another person which that other person would not or could not consent to. And if you make sure not to run afoul of either of those, then you won't do anything wrong. And an interesting thing, I'll close with this. With Kant, I said another problem with utilitarian theory is that it could be seen as too demanding. Because if you had 2 choices to make and one promotes more utility, but you have a much greater personal interest in doing the other, well, the utilitarian says you just have to break in favor of creating more overall happiness. Like, so if there was a house burning with 1 person you loved and 10 people you don't even know, utilitarianism says save the greater number. But in Kantian philosophy, that's not necessarily your obligation. Suppose that you do save the 1 person who you do love. What would be your maxim? I will save a loved one when I have the chance to do so. And if that was a universal law, it would simply be expressed as all people will save loved ones when they're able to do that without serious risk to themselves or whatever. And that's nothing undesirable or contradictory. It doesn't matter that the other action produces even more utility because we just look at it on a maxim basis. And also those people who you're not attending to, it's not that they've been exploited or used for the sake of your own purposes because you didn't put them in harm's way in the first place. So just a different flavor of ethics with different parameters and principles. Many people find this more plausible, but some people still stick to utilitarianism. But anyway, that's it for now. So we've looked at 2 main ethical theories, top to bottom. And we're going to take a couple additional meetings over the next week and 2 weeks to apply some of these theories to some real world ethical dilemmas, like whether we have obligations to the poor and stuff like that. So guys, for now, thanks again. I appreciate your attendance as usual. And from me and Peachy, I guess we're going to sign off. So let me just see in the chat that we're all good to go. All right, thanks Ryan and everyone else. Have a great day. And if you do need anything, don't forget your essays are due Wednesday. You got to send me those to my Chapman email account anytime before 9 a.m. on Wednesday. So I'll see you then, and take it easy till next time. Yeah, sorry, Brian, where do we turn in our essay you're asking me? You have to send me your essay as an email and an attached file. So my email address, vulich@chapman.edu. Simply write me a message with your email, with your attached file to the email, okay? Thank you. First draft, Sam, well, your final essay is due on Wednesday. To those that wanted to send me drafts, I received some over the weekend, but many people haven't, and it's running late on time. But if I got something in today, I might have a chance to look at it before, midday tomorrow. Okay? Well, thanks again, everyone, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.